really the important thing, the reframing that I've done there is that when I feel really uncomfortable, like I'm like, oh man, I'm way in over my head. I don't know what's going on. I feel really lost and anxious. What I realized is those are the moments when I'm learning. So the minute that I start to feel uncomfortable or I start to feel overwhelmed, immediately my brain snaps to, oh, we are about to learn a lot really fast. And so being able to reframe that as a good experience rather than a bad one, I think is really important.
For our third tech track, I'm talking to Rachel today, who is the CEO and founder of Geosite, which is a venture-backed startup building tools to manage geospatial data such as satellite, drone, and IoT data. Rachel is also an instructor at Stanford University, where she teaches about technology and national security. Rachel received her bachelor's and master's degree in mechanical engineering from Stanford, where she's also currently in the PhD program. Rachel received the Forbes 30 Under 30 Award, is a DFJ Entrepreneurial Fellow, and is a mom of 2 kids. So Rachel, my first question is, how do you do it all? You're a single founder of a startup with more than 20 employees, you're a PhD candidate at Stanford, and you're a mom. How do you fit all of that into a single day?
I think being really disciplined with time is the major way of doing it. I mean, one of the wonderful things, and you mentioned this, there are 20 people who work at my company. And for anybody who becomes an entrepreneur, one of the first things you have to learn is how to delegate and how to decide what has to be done. And I actually had a really good mentor who taught me to basically, you have your to-do list, whether it's in your head, which was not where it should be. You should always have somewhere else where you're keeping your to-do lists. And the first thing you should do is go down it and basically say, what has to be done? What is actually important on this list? And get rid of the things that you don't need to do or just simply are... they feel important, but you know that they're not actually. And if they were something that you were working with somebody else on, obviously get back to them as soon as possible saying this isn't going to be done. But take off the things that don't need to be done. From there, especially with company stuff, I have to ask myself, like, is this something somebody else at my company can do? And if it is, I ask for help, right? If there's too much going on. And so really it's about being disciplined about what you decide to spend your time on. And I'm pretty good about marking and color coding everything in my calendar. Every minute of my day during the week, so Monday through Friday, is booked solid. Basically from 7 a.m., there's even a block for bedtime, right? For putting the kids down. And then, even after that, I'm going to review these documents for my teammates. I'm going to work on these, reviewing these new product designs or whatever. So I'm going to read these academic papers. And it's all scheduled out. But then the really important thing about balancing all of this is it's not just about being really disciplined with time and really focused, but also stopping once in a while and taking a deep breath and looking at all the things that you're doing and being really grateful for doing them. And so I really don't work on the weekends. My team knows if they haven't gotten something to me on Friday morning, if I don't have time to get to it by the end of Friday, it's not going to be done until Monday. And so I really do take my weekends to spend time with my kids or to go on hikes or to exercise or do these other things that keep you fresh for the week. And so I think it's a balance of being very time disciplined during certain times and then really relaxing during other times. And for different people, that looks very different. Some people, they work really hard from early in the morning until 7 p.m. and then they're done and they take the evening off. But for me, it's, Monday through Friday, it is a solid chunk of work. And then Saturday, Sunday is completely wound down.
Yeah, I feel like for someone like you, having those boundaries is especially important because I'm sure the startup can take over your whole life
absolutely.
And more.
There's always more to do with a startup or with a PhD, right? There's always the next paper to read. There's always, this bit of data that you want to look at. There's always more that you can do, but that doesn't mean there's always more that you should do. So it's an important balance.
And I definitely want to talk more about how you manage your day now and what your day-to-day looks like with Geosite later on. But can we go back a little bit and talk about Stanford? So the way we met is my wife is really, really good friends with you. That's how I heard about you initially before I met you because how inspiring you were. Because you came to Stanford with a kind of a unique story. So can you tell us about Stanford undergrad and why that was unique?
Yeah, so I arrived at Stanford with a 8-week-old. I was basically the second undergrad that they had arrive at campus. Second undergrad ever arrive at campus with a kid, so that was a very unique experience. I was a very young mother. I my ex-husband, he was in the military, so he wasn't here either. It was really just me, and my daughter. And so it meant that, I didn't have a lot of the normal undergrad experiences. I had very different experiences than many of my peers, which Tulsi can tell you totally worked out for our crew, because it meant that we had, our own digs and a little baby to play with, which was, really fun. And I found it to be really sobering. I think when you're in undergrad, it's easy to get really wrapped up by like grades or other, metrics that you've always used to measure yourself. And basically from the very start, I had a perspective where I was able to step back and be like, okay, school really matters, but there are other things that matter. So it goes back to that balance thing. I was able to maintain that from the start. And I had to learn how to ask for help. Right. So whether it was calling, a family member and saying, hey, I have finals coming up. I'm going to be really busy. I need extra support. Can you please come out and support me? And being able to kind of ask for what I needed very early, and identify when I needed help, I think was extremely valuable. Although I wasn't as good at it in the beginning. I remember I was standing with two of the professors in the mechanical engineering department, and one of them was like, oh, did you see Rachel's capstone project? Was kind of bragging about it to this other professor as we stood there, and he was like, yeah, I can't believe she did all of that and is raising a kid. And this other professor turned to me and he was like, I didn't know that you had a kid. And I was like, well, yeah, it was never relevant. And he was like, well, you never asked for an extension, you never asked for help, you never needed any of these things. And I'm like, well, sometimes I need help, sometimes I don't. And it was really empowering to me to be able to say, okay, I have this unique circumstance and I am able to set the boundaries about when I ask for help and when I don't, and who gets to know things about what's in my personal life and who doesn't, and all of that. I think that was valuable.
And I feel like for so many of Stanford undergrads, a lot of the experiences, I'm going to go abroad, I'm going to go out to the row and party until 1 or 2 a.m. I'm going to do all of these number of things, which I imagine for you might have had to think twice about. So
Absolutely.
Did that weigh on you at all? I feel like my undergrad experience is so much different in a better or worse way.
So for me, I grew up in southern New Mexico in a fairly small town, and I had actually started college classes when I was in high school, because I had asked the school board, I basically posed to the school board, here are the metrics. Our school is multiple grade levels behind the rest of the US. I'm going to be really far behind. Please let me go take classes at the university. And so they were flexible enough that they created a program where I could go to the university. And so I had a few of those kind of very undergrad-y experiences in high school. And so by the time I got to college, I had no FOMO on the college parties. I knew it was totally not my scene. There were all sorts of things that happen on campuses with undergrads, and to me, it just seemed like a bunch of unnecessary drama and exhaustion and poisoning your body and all sorts of things that I wasn't interested in. In terms of, studying abroad, I did actually, right? So I did the study abroad in Beijing. I was able to do that when Nayena's dad had moved back to Texas and was close enough to my family. And so she was able to go live there for a few months, while I went to Beijing. And so there's really nothing that I felt like I missed out on. But that also just has to do with my personality, right? A lot of the stuff that I missed out on, were not things that I would have been doing anyway. So, yeah.
And so you majored in mechanical engineering. And
That's
obviously
correct.
you were academically gifted you took a bunch of college classes in New Mexico, where you're from. When you came to Stanford, how did you decide mechanical engineering versus another kind of engineering or even a non-engineering major?
Yeah, so I actually came to Stanford thinking I wanted to do aeroastro. I fly planes, right? I've always loved airplanes. I've always loved space. I grew up, my mom, worked on satellites and rockets, and I grew up going to see those launches. And so I have a soft spot in my heart for space, and for aerospace. And so, I thought that was going to be the right path. And then I actually started to spend as much time as the professors would give me with a bunch of different aeroastro professors, just like emailing them and saying, hey, is there any chance you have half an hour in your schedule? I'd love to ask you about what you do and learn more. And what I realized was a lot of the work in aeroastro, and of course, it's a very broad field, but a lot of it includes a lot of computer simulations, which certain fields of mechanical engineering do as well. But I am not the kind of person who can sit at a computer and focus on a problem like that. I tend to do better with a higher amount of chaos. I love uncertainty. I love dealing with really complex, intertangled human requirements for things. I love, really the combination of complexity and uncertainty. And exactly what they were trying to do with a lot of their work was remove uncertainty and complexity, right? Or add complexity, but remove uncertainty, right? And it's like, here are the variables, here are the things we were trying to do. And it's a very exact sort of work, which I realized wouldn't be a good fit for me. I think one of the most powerful things an advisor said to me in undergrad was Banny. And actually it was his class where your wife and I met. And he, I was kind of having this crisis about this is what I thought I wanted to go do, and now I don't think this is what I want to do. I don't know, I feel really lost. And the way he framed it was, you've always loved airplanes, you always will, you're always going to love space, but it doesn't have to be a part of your career. You can always have hobbies. And so it's okay to say, this is not how I want to spend my day today, in terms of my professional life. And you can still keep things as part of your own, kind of broader subset of activities in your life. And I had never really framed it that way. I thought, well, this is a very complex thing. This is something that either it's your profession or it's not part of your life. And that was really broadening for me, because I realized, not everything has to fit perfectly into these boxes of this is what I do for my work, therefore these are the things that I learned, therefore these are the things that I go do. And so that was really helpful, that I was able to say, okay, this isn't necessarily a loss. I'm not losing aeroastro. I'm putting it in a different sphere of my life, and I feel okay about it. So then I ended up in the mechanical engineering program because they have something called product design, which, if anybody's heard of design thinking, David Kelly, who is really the godfather of design, he's the one who runs the program at Stanford. So I was really lucky to have him as a professor. And the way that I really decided that was the right program for me was they would always talk about these wicked problems, or really problems that are super complex because humans are involved, and humans are really illogical. Designing for humans is really hard. It's not like designing, a subset of an aerospace system or any sort of mechanical system. If you're designing for humans, you have to do human-centered design. And especially if you're designing in complex environments, you're designing for a bunch of different humans that all have to buy into it. And I found that was the right amount of trying to impose structure on chaos that I really loved. And so did that for undergrad, found I loved manufacturing. So we got exposed to a lot of different pieces of the puzzle, and I really enjoy efficiency. If I walk into a manufacturing facility and it is perfectly set up and they do all sorts of clever things to be wildly efficient, it gives me a visceral emotional reaction because it makes me so happy. So I found I really loved manufacturing. So I did that for my master's. And then my PhD was a whole other subset of of wild opportunities in terms of how I got there. But yeah.
And one of the things that's clear about your story is how deep of deep of an attachment you have to Stanford and the people there in particular.
Yeah.
Because like when we talk about Geosite, it'll become clear to people watching that Geosite really came out of the relationships that you developed at Stanford and the ideas that you had there. And you obviously had a pretty close relationship with your advisor. So what advice do you have to students in terms of making relationships and making the most of opportunities at a place like Stanford?
Yeah. I think one of the like mindsets that I got, and I don't think it was early in undergrad, it was probably late undergrad, maybe into my master's when I really learned this, was when you feel that like slight prickle that you feel intimidated by somebody, that's usually when I'm like, ooh, I want that person around me. So that was one piece of it. Was there were incredible people doing lots of different things, but when I found somebody that was like far better than I was at something that I wished I could be good at, or even somebody who was like really good at something that I knew I would never be good at, I just found that so deeply impressive. Those were the people I tended to stay really close with, right? Are these people that now I look at them and they're off in all their careers, and they're like, one of my classmates ran for Congress. That still blows my mind. It's like they've gone off and done such different extraordinary things. And so I think forming those relationships is really important. I also wasn't necessarily very extroverted until late in undergrad. I think throughout, my early education, I was kind of an anomaly in most of my schools. And so it wasn't like I had a large group of friends who had the same outlook on education that I did. And so getting to Stanford, that took a little bit of learning that like, oh, the people here care about learning as much as I do. And to really come out of my shell probably took a couple years. But then after that, yeah, it's like just being genuine with people about what you're curious about and what you know and don't know and what you hope to learn gets you really, really far.
And when you talk to other people, like it sounds like this person who was running for Congress, they inspired you. What I'm hearing is that being around people who inspire you and kind of open your eyes to what else is possible is really important. That was a big part of your Stanford experience. How do you do that? Like, do you kind of just talk to them and hear what they're passionate about, or do you somehow assess their skill level? Like, how do you figure out who you want to surround yourself with?
It's not so measured. I think what's interesting is, now I haven't actually reflected on this. I think it's actually how we do our hiring process at Geosite as well. I love finding people who are deeply passionate about something that I didn't even understand the complexities of, right? So somebody who, comes to the table and is like, oh my gosh, they're like super, you could tell they're just like fired up. They're like DNA functionalized carbon nanotubes. And I'm like, ooh, you're excited. I have no idea what's happening, but I'm excited. Please tell me more, right? And so it really, it's not like an assessing of their skills. It's more of are they extremely passionate about what they're doing? Like, I think that is infectious, right? Like if you meet somebody who loves what they do, you want to love what they do too. And so it wasn't so much, oh, are they at the top of their class? Or, are they the best at this? It was, are they doing something that, that this is a very subjective thing, but that feels important, or feels unique, and are they passionate about it, right? And so I remember, not to just keep this about Dulcie, but I remember with her, since she's our common ground here, she really, in undergrad especially, she really loved recommendation engine type things. Like, how do we help people based on people's choices? How do we give them the next thing? And that was always a technology that kind of was in the background for me. It was making my life better, but I didn't realize it. This was back, when it was, recommendation engines weren't as developed as they are now.
Yeah, 2012, right? 2013.
Yeah. And she was there's so much that can be done here. And there's this like for her, it wasn't just about the technology being fascinating. It was that like it improves people's lives if like, if you're able to help them figure out what to do next, like help them make those decisions, help make recommendations to them. And she was like so passionate about it. I'm like, this is literally something I have never thought about. Like, this person is incredible, right? Or once I met this synthetic biologist who really studied global food security. And she was so passionate about global food security. And I was just like, I never even thought about the fact that there are people thinking about food, like, not like, I mean, I knew that like there are massive issues around food, but like, thinking about things like what happens if a virus spreads and takes out our crops and like there's global level famines, like that had never fazed me. And so I was just like, oh my gosh, you're brilliant and you're like doing something and you're passionate about it and I'm excited. And so really it's just about talking to people and asking them questions, being like, so what do you do? Well, what do you love about it? And you can tell pretty quickly if somebody really loves what they're doing. And I think if they love what they're doing, they're going to have the grit to get really far.
And how much of it do you think is due to being at Stanford? Like you talked about how you were from New Mexico. I'm so privileged and I'm lucky to have met people like you at Stanford. If you hadn't gone to Stanford, let's say that you stayed in New Mexico, how might your story have been different? Or how critical of a role did Stanford play in this?
Yeah, I mean, Stanford is so resource rich, right? And they are basically filtering out they're picking what it like. I think when we went to Stanford, it was like 5%, but now it's like 2.5% or something crazy of applicants, right? Like, like one in like 40 gets to go to Stanford, right? Like that's crazy. But that apply, right? Of the ones that even bother applying, that's how many. And so they definitely like try to filter for the people who they think are going to be that passionate, I think. So there's a higher density at Stanford. But I think you can find those people all over the place. One of the other things that I think is important is a lot of times if people lack that passion, I've found it's because they lack mentors who are giving them that passion. And so even though, yes, like Stanford plays a key role there, the faculty at Stanford, of course, are like, world class, like literally top professors in the world. The students are, some of the most ambitious, brilliant, passionate people in the world. But I don't think that you have to be somewhere like Stanford to find those people. And then on top of that, because I'm actually the only one at my company that went to Stanford. On top of that, I think that if you are really passionate about what you do, and if you are privileged enough to have been exposed to those types of resources, it's then really important to go share those things with others. So, for instance, there's a entrepreneurial center at New Mexico State University. And, I provide myself as a mentor. Like, hey, if you have entrepreneurs and they need a mentor, connect them with me and I'm happy to help them, right? And in that case, it's sharing a passion for entrepreneurship. And so it's a feedback loop. So the first is, yes, if you're somewhere like Stanford, you absolutely are going to run into more of these people. But also, if you are one of those people, go out into the world and try to inspire more people, right?
At the end of your time at undergrad at Stanford, mechanical engineer, how do you think about the landscape now? Do you go out and get a job as a mechanical engineer, or do you do a master's, which is what you picked? How did you think about that?
So, at the end of undergrad, so I've never been a good standardized test taker. So we'll start there. And to do the master's program, you have to take the GRE. And I did fairly poorly on the GRE. Because again, I don't do well with structured problem solving. I do well with like a ton of chaos, which is why I realized entrepreneurship, right? Later on, I was like, oh, entrepreneurship, peak chaos. I will do well here. Or like not just chaos, but ambiguity, right? And these tests really test for like specific kinds of reasoning, specific kinds of skills. And so I, took the GRE, didn't do well, took it again, did slightly better, but still not great, like 75th percentile, right? Which is not good enough for a Stanford master's program most of the time. And so I was like, well, I'll apply. If I get in, I'll do it. If I don't, here are the other things that I'll consider. And, I knew that my application was weak because of that, but I went to my advisors and said, hey, how much this was specifically to do the manufacturing track within mechanical engineering. So I went to my professors and I said, hey, how much I love this field. And how passionate about it I am. Would you mind writing me a letter of recommendation, right? And so I beefed up my application with that to see if they'd let me squeak by with my bad scores. And they did, right? And so my deal with myself had been, if I get in, I'll do it. Because I knew that there was, I felt that there was a pretty good chance that I wouldn't get in, because from everyone else, the standard wisdom was, unless you reach X score, you're not going to get in. And I had not reached X score. So I was like, well, it's a long shot. We'll see. And so, when I got in, I was like, okay, well, my deal with myself was I'll do it. And so I did. And, but what was interesting about that was I had applied for other jobs and I had started to think about what do I want to do in the future. And so that set me up later down the road, once I reached that same decision point for PhD, kind of understanding the landscape. So it was important that before I made that decision, I went pretty far down a bunch of different paths. I, negotiated salaries with a couple of people. One was a very design-heavy job at a car company, and then the other was actually as a patent agent. So I had found I really liked patents. There's something really beautiful about how clever you have to be in terms of how patents get worded, and it re-adds that human complexity element to engineering. So you take these really complex engineering ideas and then you try to find ways to turn it into the strongest patent possible, and that was very fun to me. And so there were these two very different paths, both of which I found very interesting. And I think for me, having multiple options that I was really excited about made me even more excited about the option that I did decide to go with.
Can we talk now about the genesis of Geosite and how that's intimately tied with the PhD program at Stanford that you were part of, or you still are part of? So how did you make the decision to do the PhD program, and who did you meet, or what were the relationships you developed in that program?
Yeah, so I guess this gets back to just kind of a broader piece of advice is, you should always be looking for opportunities that don't fit the mold of the path that you thought you would be on. So my company really arose out of a bunch of separate opportunities that I had said yes to, not necessarily knowing where they would go or what the plan was, just knowing it was something I was interested in and that I would be able to execute at a really high level, right? So the first was, I was married to somebody in the military for a very long time. And I had grown up, working on military bases, going to military bases with my mother. And so I had a really good ability to communicate with people about national security. And so this was kind of this weird other random skill that I had. I like to describe people as puzzle pieces. You have kind of your core competencies and there's probably some gaps in there, but then you have these weird other little blobs kind of stuck on the side. That weird other blob that was stuck on the side was the fact that I could really easily communicate with people in the military or in national security in their own language, right?
Yeah. So I'll just mention that I think that is really unique. I mean, for people who aren't in the Bay Area or at Stanford, the fact that you had that skill, and a very deep skill, that's something that most Stanford people don't know anything about. So I just wanted to mention
totally. And I would say another one that has to do probably with where I grew up. New Mexico is very, very much a meritocracy, and feeling intimidated by other people because of their position or rank was not something I was ever taught. So I also could walk into a room and there'd be multiple generals there and me be like, no, that's not how machine learning works. does somebody have a whiteboard? Let me just teach you guys real quick couple things about this and why you don't have the training data. You can't just like magically do things, right? And so I knew enough about a bunch of different fields of engineering to be like dangerous. And then I'd have to like call one of my friends after and be like, is that actually how machine learning works? Yeah. Okay, cool. Got that one right. Or ping them back and be like, actually, let me connect you to this expert who will correct all the things that I just said. But you know, I could go like, so that's the other piece, right? Like, so not only could I communicate with them in third language, which is just people here in the Bay Area don't know how to do that. And actually that has extended into, you know, my company went through Y Combinator. I started the like Y Combinator Slack channel for companies that are trying to work in defense, because now I try to mentor any YC companies who are trying to work with the military and are finding it to just be a black box and they have no idea where to start, because it can be very intimidating. So between those two superpowers, basically, I became known as the nerd that they could put in the room and they would translate, right? So if, you know, a special operations command, you know, set of personnel was coming to Stanford, or like, you know, if a delegation was coming, or even like a Senate delegation, or even, you know, an Army delegation or whatever was coming to Stanford to learn about new technologies, and then they had, you know, computer scientists or aerospace engineers or whatever, they would put me in the room basically as the translator. And, you know, this wasn't a structured choice. It wasn't like, oh, this is going to lead to a career for me. It was just interesting, right? And it meant that I got to learn a lot about what was happening in national security. It meant that I got to learn a lot about what was happening in different technical fields that I hadn't actually touched. And from that arose a couple of opportunities. One that, you know, ultimately led to my PhD, one that ultimately led to my company. And so the first is they put together for each new administration, it sounds like something like a villain would have from like a movie. They call it their strategic master plan. And basically, which like cracks me up. I'm like, oh, I, you know, wrote a portion of the strategic master plan. So they have this strategic master plan, and there's different subsections. And so they were doing a section on ultra low cost access to space and the security implications. And so
sorry, the strategic master plan is for the military, like the general who?
So the military writes it, and it's usually there's a couple of generals who are in charge of commissioning other people to write it, usually researchers, right? So in this case at Stanford. And it's for each incoming president. So every time there's going to be a new administration, a new president.
Oh, okay. We're talking about like Donald Trump, that level president. Yes. Oh, wow.
Yes.
Okay. Got it.
And the military provides it to them and say, basically, here are the major strategic challenges over the next 20 years is the scope of it. And, you know, they try to boil it down into chapters that kind of take all of the best knowledge that's in everybody's heads, and gets it into, you know, a single set of documents. So one segment of this in the space chapter was a section on this ultra low cost access to space, right? Which of course we've all, you know, really excitingly watched, you know, Crew Dragon go up this summer. That stuff is very flashy, but the stuff that's happening in the background is actually also really exciting. You know, launching satellites is far cheaper than it's ever been. And so there's multiple things here. The first is that if you have so many different commercial companies creating and launching satellites, you know, one of the things back to my love of manufacturing that I pointed out was like, there's no manufacturing standards around the like buses that go on these satellites. And that's a huge security concern. And so, you know, there were recommendations in there about that. There were recommendations about, you know, data standards. There were recommendations around, you know, here is how we do counterterrorism, right? Like, what do you do when the cost to launch a satellite is within the budget of an organization like Al-Qaeda, right? Like, those are hard questions. So there were, you know, quite a few recommendations there. And then one of them was, you know, there's this proliferation of data, but there's also far more users that want direct access to that data. And the plumbing doesn't exist, right? Which of course is partially caused by some of these other problems like lack of data standards, which makes it hard to fuse data. But then also the software is missing. There aren't very many interfaces for non-technical users to access spatially relevant data. So it was like, hey, if you're trying to close this feedback loop between images being taken in space, communication of IoT sensors on the ground through space platforms, that data isn't going into any sort of useful systems. And so that's slowing things down. And like a naive bureaucrat, I was like, there, I told them what the problem is. They'll handle it from here. I'm done. And, went off to pursue a lot of other opportunities. But of course, that ended up circling back around to being my company, which you explained in the beginning. We help aggregate geospatial data. So we can get back to that. But in a separate one of these meetings was General Nakasone, who is the commander of Army Cyber. Now he's the commander of all of Cyber Command and the director of the NSA. And he posed the question that we don't know how to run engineering teams inside of the military. If you think about militaries, usually other people are designing and building the tools that they use, offensive and defensive tools. But now, if you think about how important computer science is, people inside the military are creating offensive and defensive tools. And so they had never had to deal with running, at scale, their own engineering teams. And so the question was, how do we do this? We need hierarchy because, legally we need hierarchy, both through conventions, but also because when you're doing things that are so dangerous, geopolitically, but also like, shutting off, equipment, other places and doing things that can be very, literally risk human life, you have to have hierarchy, right? Like you have to have somebody who's saying like, this is okay, this is not, this I'll approve, this I won't approve, right? Like you have to have it. And at the same time, you also need bureaucracy because these are huge organizations. And so you need a lot of coordination, and that coordination comes through policies and practices, right, which is bureaucracy. And so his question was, how do we balance the need for innovation or, new product development, or allowing our engineers to really, approach problems broadly, but still maintain bureaucracy and hierarchy. And I found that to be a really interesting problem. And I was like, there's actually a lot of organizational research on this. I'm sure I'll look in the literature. Back in the 80s, all the big organizations like IBM, Ford, etc., were going through this process. So I'm sure there's an answer. And as I looked through the literature, nobody had actually studied the usually reduced bureaucracy or hierarchy as a means to the end of innovation. And I felt like that was an oversimplification because in my mind, coming from a manufacturing background where things are very standard, there's a lot of process, but there's also a lot of innovation. Coming from design thinking where I really understand how humans function, I was like, this doesn't seem right. Like, I think you can have bureaucracy and hierarchy and innovation if you do it correctly. And so I circled back and was like, okay, you're right. There is no literature on this. But I think that this is a really interesting problem. And so basically he said, do you want to study all these engineering teams? And I was like, sure. And so my PhD came from really somebody planting a seed of like a really hard, interesting problem, and then giving me access to actually go and try to solve that problem. And so I'm still working on my PhD work. I'm not in a huge rush to finish it because I really love it. And I think if I didn't have my PhD work, I would just be thinking about my company all the time, which I love my company. But I'm still a little bit of an academic at heart. So it's nice being able to flip back into academic mode. But yeah, so both of those spiraled out of opportunities that I didn't see coming.
And I think what's really amazing about like the genesis of both the PhD and Geosite is that you were at the intersection, like you mentioned, of computer science, design thinking, mechanical engineering, aero-astro, and this knowledge that you already had about the military, right? So you were such a unicorn of being right in the middle and knowing enough about all these different fields to be dangerous and offer ideas and translate between them. And I'll connect it back to, like, I teach programming, basically in particular Android programming. So a lot of people watching are probably Android developers. And so what I always tell people is exactly kind of the journey that you're living out, which is that being a vanilla Android developer probably isn't enough if you want to have tremendous impact on the world. If you want to have outsized impact on the world, it's not enough to just do Android. You have to do Android with like low-powered devices, Android with IoT, or Android with something else to make you sit at the intersection where very few people are. And that's exactly, it sounds like what you did.
Yeah. And I think we actually had at some point one of the professors in the design program, because as a product designer, there's so many things you can go do that there aren't really well-defined paths. So they actually were very deliberate about helping us learn how to find our niche. And like, really it's about sitting down and saying, what are the things that I either have access to or have knowledge about or am like so crazy passionate about that nobody can out passion me on this because like I love it so much, right? Like, what are the things that you have in your toolkit, and then just like lean into them, right? And also a big piece of this is being willing to be in over your head, right? So even though I don't get easily intimidated, even though, you know, I spoke both these languages, walking into a room where, you know, I'm 30 or 40 years younger than everyone else there. Or, you know, there was a time when I was embedded with a special operations unit for a little bit. Like, I was clearly in over my head, right? Like, absolutely in over my head, and felt very uncomfortable a few times. And like, really the important thing, the reframing that I've done there is that when I feel really uncomfortable, like I'm like, oh man, I'm way in over my head, I don't know what's going on, I feel really lost and anxious, what I realized is those are the moments when I'm learning. So the minute that I start to feel uncomfortable or I start to feel overwhelmed, immediately my brain snaps to, oh, we are about to learn a lot really fast. And so being able to reframe that as a good experience rather than a bad one, I think is really important. And being willing to be like, you know, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to try this and it's going to be crazy and I'll learn something.
All right, talking about Geosite, from the outside, it looks like you're living the Silicon Valley dream, right? It's a venture-backed startup. You're growing a lot. You're doing really amazing work. So can we talk about, you're a single founder and
Yep.
You come up with the idea of Geosite. What was your first thought? Like, raise money, find a co-founder? Like, how did that process happen? And how did you tell us about the first few months of Geosite?
You know, so Geosite was really deliberate. So I knew, so let's see, it was spring of 2017. I had done all my data collection for my PhD. And so now I had my body of data and I didn't need to travel anymore for it. And now it was really about spending a lot of time with the literature and starting to write things up. And I knew that wasn't going to be enough for me. Like, I was going to get bored or like I'm very impatient. The pace of a PhD is hard for me, essentially. And so I knew that, okay, I need to be doing something else on the side. I had tried a few, jobs that I could balance with it, and I wasn't super excited. And I really felt extremely passionate about the geospatial problem. I had worked with one of the units I had worked with. We had done a root cause analysis on mission failures and casualties, and the inability to maintain a common operating picture, the inability to pull together, satellite imagery and maps and plans and understand what's going on in the world had literally caused people to die, right? And so I felt very passionate about the problem. And, I think one of the things that I tell people is, if you're going to start a company, it is really, really hard. It's really hard. I've raised 2 kids. Starting a company, I think, is harder. Maybe that's just like some sort of quirk of my kids who are extremely well behaved. So I'm sure it depends on the kid. Starting a company is really hard. So work on something that really matters to you. And so for me, this problem was literally keeping me up at night. And so I decided, you know what, I'm going to take a stab at trying to fix this, whether it's, and I didn't really actually care if it was me starting a company, if it was me finding a company that was trying to solve it, but failing and jumping in to try to help them, whether it was, going out and figuring out how to aggregate a couple solutions and put them together towards the problem. the company wasn't actually the goal to me. Solving the problem was. So I did Startup Garage, which is at the Stanford Business School, in fall and winter. So that's, basically September through March, right? So September 2017 to March 2018. And, roped in a friend who was at Stanford, who was an active duty SEAL. He had no plans of joining the company full time, but was like, yeah, I'll help you do market research and we can sort this out and figure out what this company is. And so we spent basically 9 months, because it was that spring all the way through the next, March, or it was like almost summer through that next March. So it was almost 9 months where Geosite wasn't a company. I was just obsessed with this problem. And I mapped out the entire industry, which of course was a little bit easier because I had already done a study on the entire geospatial industry for the Air Force. So I had a good start point. I, obsessively studied the problem, talked to as many people as I could. I tried to figure out market positioning, tried to look for other companies that were solving it. And then ultimately nothing existed. And the research showed that it was a massive opportunity. And so I basically was like, okay, the only option here is starting a company. Like, starting the company was almost a process of elimination. Like, are there any ways, like, what is the best way to get at this? And it just turned out that starting a new company and launching a product was the best way to solve the problem. And, that's not always the case for many problems. And so, started the company and started fundraising in about March. And it was me and a slide deck. And I was looking for like angel investment so I could hire my first engineers. I already had full mock-ups, wireframes of what the first version of the product would look like. I had already floated it by customers. I had all the data to show that this was a real thing. And so I would have loved to have a co-founder, but I didn't feel like it was necessary for me to have, a co-founder in order to start the company, because I already knew what the company was. And so, I looked pretty hard. I talked to a ton of people. I reached out throughout my network, and eventually found, it had nothing to do with any of my outreach. One of the soldiers who had been on one of the teams at Cyber Command that I had studied reached out and was like, hey, Rachel, I'm getting out of the military. Do you know of any cool stuff in the Bay Area that I could work on? And I was like, oh man, do I have a project for you? Because I had seen the work that he had done in the military, and I knew that there were several analogous skills. And on top of that, I knew that we got along, which is really important. Founder conflict is a big issue. And so I knew that he and I's personalities clicked very well. He's very stoic, very, very earnest. And those are all really good qualities to me, right? Those are qualities that complement my style. And so, yeah, he joined the team in early 2019. We had just started Y Combinator. So I had hired, a couple of contract engineers to build the first versions of the prototype, was starting to get customer LOIs, was like, okay, now I need to really start to turn up the volume, was going to raise a seed round in fall of 2018. But then a good friend of mine who had been through YC was like, you should do YC. It's a good community. And so I did YC instead. So then that started in January, and he started about then. And then we ended 2019 with 13 people, and now we're about 25. So it's been just skyrocketing. So I think the core of it is, what is it like being a solo founder? It's hard. You have to build a community around you, but I think you should do that anyway, right? Of close friends, great mentors, like as many people around you who can see your blind spots as possible, and as many people around you who care about what you're doing and care about you as possible, because it's just hard. And so I have a few CEO besties, is what I like to call them. So CEOs of other small, tech companies that are growing really rapidly. And, we call each other constantly like, hey, I'm having this, I don't know how to structure this contract, or, hey, I don't know where to look for this type of person, or I don't understand, this or that. And so having a good peer group is really important.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I've heard, I've never been a CEO, so not yet, but what I've heard is that it's a lonely job, right? I mean, being a founder is a lonely job because it's you and typically your other co-founder who knows
Yeah.
what the problems are, but a lot of other people don't. And I imagine that support structure you're talking about is even more important if you're a single founder.
Yeah, I'd say it's a lonely job. Like, so that what makes it lonely is not that. Okay, so I'm struggling to like say this diplomatically. It depends on what kind of founder you are and what kind of CEO you are, ultimately. I have always, and this gets back to what I was talking about, even with undergrad, I've always been the kind of person that feels confident enough to show other people what my problems are, right? And I feel self-assured enough to say, hey, I am having this problem and I need help with it, right? So for me, it's never felt particularly alone, because both my first set of investors, which was bee partners, BEE, like the insect that makes honey, right? Bee partners, I love them. They are they are the epitome of founder friendly. They are extremely supportive. They trust me to lead my company. So, but at the same time, they're completely there if I need to bounce ideas off them, or for them to play devil's advocate, or just be support, right? And so I was lucky to have great investors. I had already fostered a good group, of friends and other things to help support me. And so I'm very quick to be like, hey, I have this problem and I don't know what to do. Like, how would you frame out thinking about this? And I do it very early. Like as soon as I recognize the problem, I'll be like, hey, I'm not even sure if this is a problem yet. So sometimes I'm not even sure if it's a problem yet. I'm like, I'm not sure if this is a problem yet, but I had this like gut feeling. Have you seen this before? Do you have any ideas? And so it's never been lonely in that sense. Where it does get lonely is when there are really hard decisions to be made. And maybe you've already asked for help, gotten all the advice you can, you have all of it in front of you, and ultimately it's your call, right? And so you have to make that decision. Luckily, to me, once I've gathered all the evidence that I need to make a decision, it usually becomes pretty clear, and so it doesn't feel as hard. But I would say it doesn't have to be lonely. It's lonely because of people's egos. So yeah.
So you can approach it with the right attitude, so it's not as isolating.
Exactly. Like if you're willing to tell people like, oh my gosh, this is hard, it gets a lot easier, right? And of course you can't do that with everybody. It's not like I could be like calling, my CTO has all of his own stressors. I can't call him and be like, oh my gosh, this is so hard. And he'd be like, yeah, I know, it's so hard. I feel like, yeah, okay. But like I could have, other CEOs around me, or just like other friends who I can tell that to. So yeah, so our first two main customer groups were the military and oil and gas. So, in both cases, we were helping increase safety of remote operations. So to us, it's like, yes, these are our customer base. Like these are possibly controversial customers, but we're keeping people safe. We're increasing efficiency. Like we know we're solving a part of this problem that we care about. But we definitely had an investor say, to one of our investors, as they were trying to syndicate to them, oh, aren't they that company that works with the military and oil and gas? Yeah, we're not interested. And I was like, that's a very naive view of the world. Like you feel very safe here in the US because we have such a great national security apparatus, which of course there's always room for improvement. And people within national security are the first to like lay out all the issues. But to just have a blanket stance of like, I won't support the military, to me, it just doesn't work, right? Because the better tools they have, the fewer mistakes there are, the safer it is, the more accurate we can be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we would run into that periodically, but not as often. The harder part of fundraising is nobody tells you how many investors you have to talk to. Like I think the average for a seed round is 60 different VC firms. So that's a lot of meetings. Like if you are trying to do it, and like it's not like you meet with each of them once. On average, I would say I met with each one 2 or 3 times. I think I only made it up to 45 VCs, and then I was like, I'm done. And we actually didn't reach our goal for our seed round because we were just done. And also we had just gotten a 7-figure contract from a customer. So we were like, we also don't need to raise anymore. So we're done. And they were all like, wait, you're done? We were like, yeah, we're done. We're done. We're not taking any more meetings. And that was a really nice feeling. But I used to always wonder how politicians can repeat themselves over and over and over and over. Fundraising was that, because every new person you hop on the phone with is like, so tell me your story. You're like, okay. And you just like flip it on, right? My CTO is joking that for our A round, which we're going to raise later this year, he's going to make me like a soundboard that has like, during the first few pitches, I'll like record my like spiel for different kinds of questions, and then they can be talking and I can be sitting there sending emails or whatever and just like click the button and it'll play the response, because he was like, I don't know how you do this. Are you losing your mind? I was like, yes, I am losing my mind. So I know very few founders who love fundraising. It's just not fun, but it's necessary, right? And it's also kind of extraordinary to somebody like me that, I grew up in a very, very, very poor area of, New Mexico. By far not the poorest area in New Mexico, but still like the dollar amounts that we're talking about in these meetings are like unimaginable to me, right, as a kid. And so the fact that, yes, they get ownership in my company, but I can actually raise funds to give people jobs to create a company. Like that blows my mind, and makes me feel really lucky. So it's exhausting and it's miserable and totally worth it.
Yeah, what I've heard is that fundraising is essentially a full-time job, right? And that must be frustrating as a founder because you want to focus on the product. You want to focus on the thing that you want to create into the world, but you're spending all the 45, several meetings each with 45 different companies or investors must be exhausting.
Yeah. And sometimes in the peak of fundraising, it's like 5 or 6 meetings a day. What I found was 6 was kind of my cap, and I can't have 6 of the same hour-long conversation in a day. I can't have more than 6. Like at one point I had 8 meetings in a day, and I was like sitting there with like my forehead on my desk, like talking to them. I was just like, I can't do this anymore. I'm losing my mind.
Can you share?
So, yeah.
Was there anything that, because like you said, you did this so much. Is there anything you can share in terms of wisdom about how to present a slide deck or the company vision or yourself in order to make it as compelling as possible to the other side?
Yeah, so it's really dependent on what it is you're pitching. So I'm going to give that like annoying answer of it depends, but the right way to like find out what you need to be doing for your story is find people you can do practice pitches with. And even though it might feel awkward, even your friends can be a good person to like run your deck by, because as a founder, you live and breathe your company. And so you forget what other people actually know. And so practicing is actually number one. Like the order of the deck can change, the stuff that you cover in the deck can change, all of that stuff. I've run my pitches many, many, many different ways. And ultimately, it's just practicing, showing it to people who have seen decks before. If you can get somebody to look at it and give you feedback with those first couple meetings, usually a lot of founders will do kind of what they call like warm-up pitches, where they'll do the pitch, but the point of the pitch is not necessarily to close the investor, it's to get feedback on the deck. So they'll pitch and then they'll kind of commandeer the meeting and say, well, so what do you think that the pitch needed? Like, we know that maybe our pitch isn't there yet. Do you have any advice? Are there some ways that I could have been clearer? And you use that as an opportunity to learn and iterate really quickly right at the beginning of the fundraise until you feel like you can nail it. And what I mean by nail it is you know exactly when the other person is going to ask a question, because like you have set it up for them to ask a question right then that you already have the answer to, right? Like you know exactly what is in the mind of the person that you're pitching to, and that just takes practice.
I like that. Can we talk about recruiting? So, you
Yeah.
have more than 20 employees now. And software, it sounds like software is the core of Geosite. It's like how you pipe data
Yep.
in and out and how do you present it in a meaningful way. How do you think about recruiting in general? And in particular, I'd like to hear your thoughts about software engineering recruiting.
Yeah. So recruiting in general, we, I feel my poor team. We are the startup with the most bureaucracy ever because I have such a deep love of bureaucracy. So we have actually really set processes for how we run interviews. I mean, on top of that, because I did so much org theory for my PhD, I've read tons of literature on like empirical studies of different, the efficacy of different hiring processes, right? So I was like, okay, here is based on the research, these are the best practices for hiring. Here are the different things that we need to measure. Here are the different things that we care about. And so we have a very clean set hiring process. So the first step is a phone screen. You'd be amazed how many applicants just actually aren't serious. Or are like terrible fits for the role. Like they apply for it and it's like, this is a front end role. And they're like, oh, well, actually I'm a back end engineer. And it's like, well, why did you, so, like, we both know you're not the right person for this is what we're hiring. So we weed those out super fast. And then the next step is a technical interview. And so that's across the board. So if it's a salesperson, it's, sales questions. If an engineer, it's very specific engineering questions to the role that they're going to be stepping into. And then after that, we do a fit interview, which is more focused on who is this person? This gets back to what I was talking about earlier. Are they passionate about what they do? Do they care? Is this somebody we want to spend our lives with? Because we spend so much time building Geosite. We have to accept that whoever we put on our team is somebody we're going to spend, a significant portion of the next, several years of our life with. So it really matters that they're a good human. And then last is actually usually a full day or a half day. It used to be in person, but kind of activity with the rest of the team. So we'll temporarily give them Slack access so they can communicate with other team members and basically run a tiny simulation of what it would be like to work with them. So we have a really rigid process. And then even within like the fit interview, there's a specific script because there are like really specific questions that I want answered by every candidate so we can compare them side by side. But ultimately, those are really the only way that we're measuring the candidate. We don't really care about where they're coming from. We don't care what schools they went to. I don't even know off the top of my head where most of my teammates went to college. It just doesn't matter necessarily. Our lead designer has a degree in accounting, right? Like, there are people who like flip into other careers and we totally get that. And so really we just measure them along those metrics of like, can they do the job? Are they really passionate about what they're doing? And is this somebody we want to work with? Because even if their job evolves, if they're passionate and they're smart and they care and they, are easy to work with, they can learn new things. That's pretty easy for a good engineer.
In terms of sourcing, have you found, is it right now, are you at the point where it's primarily through your network or the network of the team, or have you found particular like career fairs or something?
I think, this is where I don't know. My CTO does a great job of hiring our engineering team. He's very much the top of funnel there. I think we use AngelList. We post certain roles on LinkedIn, but that's usually for roles where the people would have a LinkedIn. So it's not always the engineering roles. I think we post it on Work at a Startup, which is YC's site. We posted I think we even post it on Indeed. I don't know. We post jobs, we cross-list it all over the place. And then we like narrow the funnel very quickly. Yeah.
One question about the growth of Geosite. There's a transition that happens in every company's life cycle where they go from the CEO being the kind of chief product officer and they transition into being the chief company officer. Like your baby is essentially the company and not so much the product anymore. So can you talk about that transition? Have you hit that yet? Or how do you delegate effectively?
Yeah. So It's a really hard transition. It's an especially hard transition for a founder who went to one of the best schools for product design in the world, right? So like my product design skills are highly honed in, and I can pull off in terms of product design all sorts of things very quickly, whereas for other people it would take more work just because I have a good intuition for it. So we have worked towards that. The added complexity is we work in two very different industries. So we almost have two separate business units, right? We have our commercial products, which primarily focus around remote operations and then methane emissions tracking and response. And then another set of products that have to do with, military operations. And now actually we're doing a lot of work on risk to personnel based on COVID, right? So like we have a handful of different products that all are built on top of our platform and use the same toolkit. But so for now, I still am very engaged in that process. But the good news is the section leads that we have are such experts that actually the cognitive load on me is much lower because the delegation is, okay, go figure this out and process this information. Hand me the information more processed and I'll do some final sign-offs on it, right? And so really it's that I see my teammates' brains as like an extension of my brain. Like I can't learn everything. So I'm like, okay, you go learn everything about what sort of aerial platforms we can use to collect methane emissions. You go learn about these things. You go learn about these things, right? And then we all gather up and they're like, okay, here's all this stuff. And then I look at the stuff and I'm like, all right, here's what we're going to do, right? And then we charge ahead. But in terms of setting the company up where the company is the product, it's really about finding people who can be leaders going into the future. So even if it's a junior role, we ask people what they think about leadership. Like, what do you see as the role of a leader? Because we're already vetting people for moving into those positions. And then the second piece is we actually make sure to mentor and grow the people on the team. So, for instance, we had a junior front-end engineer become a mid-level full stack engineer in less than a year. And we have like very specific criteria for what counts as junior versus mid versus, senior. And the fact that we had somebody that was able to not only expand his technical expertise, but also move into a new tier of a role, to me meant, oh, we have this like mentorship and leadership thing figured out. So like the machine that is Geosite that needs to grow people into leadership as the company continues to grow is set up to do that. And that's really important.
Makes sense. I want to acknowledge, Rachel, that when you walk in and you give your pitch, you are very unique. So I'm talking about your PhD candidate at Stanford. You are a single founder. And then I think the other big things I do want to call out is that you're a female founder. 3%, we were talking earlier, 3% of venture funding goes into female founders, which is such a tiny amount compared to what it should be.
Well, so female, let me correct that, 3% to female CEOs. So if you expand it out to co-ed teams where there's a male CEO and a female co-founder, the number is larger. But female CEOs, it's 3%.
Yeah, and then on top of that, you're a mom of 2 kids. And so I just want to mention that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on how did that weigh on you mentally? Because I think for you care about the product. You think of yourself as a founder. But when people look at you, it's like, Rachel, she's so kind of unique. She's a unicorn. Like she has all these things going on about her. So how do you deal with that?
I'm really good at focusing. So I remember once I thought, do you know what would be interesting is writing down like a timeline of all the things that have happened in the last 10 years. And I started to write down the timeline of like, having my first kid, having my second kid, having a spouse get deployed, right? Traveling abroad, starting a company, doing these research, like all of this stuff that has happened since basically a decade. Oh my gosh, I can't believe how old we are now. Over the last decade. And as I was looking at it, I started to feel overwhelmed, right? It's like, I'm still human. I'm capable of being overwhelmed, right? And so like I was looking at it and like starting to like draw everything out because I was just curious, and I stopped and I was like, I really don't need to look at all of this at once. And so it's really, for me, in terms of how I balance that, there are a couple weird things, like when people know who I am, but like I've never met them before. That's happened a couple times now, and I have a feeling it'll happen more. That's something that's very uncomfortable because I'm an open book, but I tend to have very small like personal circles. And so when somebody walks up to me and they know all this stuff about me, which of course I share, right? Like today, like I have no problem sharing it. But then they come up to me and they're like, oh my gosh, like all these things. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this person like knows who but it's like, it's less that I'm uncomfortable that they know who I am. I'm uncomfortable that there's like this imbalance because I'm like, well, tell me about you. Like, you know all these things about me and I don't even know who are you? What was your name again? Like, I'm so sorry. I don't know anything about you. And like that's like one of the very uncomfortable things. But in terms of the rest of it, it's about being able to focus. So like I said, Monday through Friday, I am hyper focused on my company. Fridays, I work on my PhD or here or there if I need to, because by Fridays, things are winding down with the rest of the team. They've like gotten what they need and, whatever. And then on the weekends, I just focus on family and on, my health and things like that. And so it's about being able to like just focus down to like, here's the thing I'm doing right now. Here's what matters. And so I think it's actually very rare that I sit down and think of like, oh my gosh, I'm ready. I don't sit down and like list out my resume to myself. I just work on one thing at a time and stay focused. And I think one thing I want to mention too is this is a more recent skill. And this happened because I was working with a military unit that had events that had happened that I was not like mentally prepared to deal with. And we were talking through things and I realized like, we can talk about the problems, we can talk about the technology, but I don't need to know everything all the time. So I am really, really careful about protecting my own mental health so that I can stay focused. So, when COVID was really bad, right? And we were all obsessively checking the numbers and checking the news. I found myself getting in that cycle of getting really wrapped up in what was happening in the world and really trying to like carry the weight of the stress of all the things happening in the world. Which meant that I couldn't do the other things that I needed to do. And then I would feel guilty that like, oh, I haven't like gotten all of these things done that I need to get done. And part of it's because I'm busy, stressed about this, these other things. And so really it's about being able to find the right times to deal with different kinds of stressors. And so I basically backed up and said, okay, I will check the news once in the morning and once in the evening. I will not look at it during the day. Like during the like 10 hours that I'm working during the day, like nothing so extreme is going to change that someone won't like call me about that I need to know, right? Like if a global war breaks out, somebody's going to call me. Like, so I don't need to expose myself to everything all the time. And so I think being willing to protect your mental health is really important when you're doing a lot of different things that are all really heavy. And that also takes self-discipline, of course. And like now I only look at the news once a day. And that's my usual, right? My usual is that I glance at the news once a day. Even then, like when I was in the midst of fundraising, right after YC, I wasn't even reading the news. I was like, there are so many things happening in the world right now that I can't help fix because I'm really busy. And like stressing about these things isn't going to let me help fix them. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be informed, but you should choose when to be informed. So I basically, while we were in the midst of fundraising, stopped reading the news because I was like, I need to be hyper-focused on this, and this needs to be like the only thing that I'm throwing willpower at. And I remember walking into the office, and we had this little tiny office. Walking into the office, and my CTO was sitting there, and he was like, man, did you see that about Notre Dame? When Notre Dame there had been that fire in Notre Dame. I was like, what are you talking about? He was like, oh, you really don't read the news? And I was like, no, I don't. And he was like, oh, wow. And I was like, I only have so much space. So I think it's important to see yourself as a resource that you're deciding to spend very deliberately on specific things.
And I'm wondering, I love that advice of being deliberate at how you spend your time and how you choose not to do things which may not be productive to what you're doing right now. There's also one more aspect, which is that sometimes when you go about your day, you have to, in some sense, come across people or things that they, even if you don't want to, they might remind you of something, or they might say, oh,
Totally.
you are very different, even if you don't really want to kind of
Yeah.
acknowledge it. How do you deal with that? Are you just very aggressive about cutting those people out, or what advice do you have about that aspect?
You mean cutting people out who stress me, or cutting people out who?
Yeah, like for the news thing, it's like something that you're totally in control of, right? Like
Yeah,
I can
yeah.
choose to read the New York Times in the morning and evening, and that's it, or whatever it
Yeah.
might be. How about for things where you go about your day and you have a meeting and you may not have control over what they bring up, or
Yeah.
what you come across with someone you work with? How do you deal with that aspect?
I mean, so in that case, like, the good news is I am pretty tough. So I just like deal with it, right? If something comes up during the day that like triggers me or just like is hard, right? Like I had a family member go through something really hard, and of course that hit like in the middle of a day, and it was like, this is a thing that needs to be dealt with right now. If emotionally there are things that need to be handled, usually, like for me, and this is like I mentioned earlier, is having a good group of support. Talking to people is always really nice. So whether it's, maybe we were in a meeting with a customer and the customer said something that I thought wasn't okay. We deal with a couple, actually the DoD and all of the people we've dealt with there are wonderful. Periodically in dealing with very old-fashioned oil and gas companies, they don't understand that a woman can run a tech company. At one point somebody called me they were like, I was at a conference, they were like, oh, I thought you were a booth babe, which are literally like women that they hire who are pretty to stand at their booth to like get people to come over to their booth. And I was like, no, I run this company, right? And so there are times where there are things that are like hard and point out that I'm different, point out that I'm a woman, or especially point out that I'm a young woman. And so there are things like that come up, and really it's that, either my teammate who was there with me or things like that, like we just address it and go like, that really was not fun. And we just like rip the Band-Aid off and then move on with our day. So I think being able to just like dive headfirst into the things that make you upset or uncomfortable is also helpful. My analogy is always like, if you think there might be a monster in the closet, like the best way to resolve the situation is to go check. Like just look to see if there's a monster in the closet. If there is, just look at the monster and be like, oh yeah, there's one there. Great, I know now. What's even better is grabbing a friend and looking at the monster in the closet with your friend. So being like, hey, here's this thing that's really hard. Can we like dig into it just a little bit and like make sure I'm okay? And you just like get into it, get it over with, and then just move on. And so I think being very direct helps with those things. And when other people make me uncomfortable or say things that aren't okay, I just tell them, I'm like, that wasn't okay. You should not do that again.
So as we wrap up, Rachel, this has been really helpful and illuminating for me. What wisdom do you want to share as we end the interview?
Yeah, I mean, I want to share wisdom that I think is common wisdom, but I actually experienced about a week ago. I was on the phone with one of my teammates, and we were trying to find time to like get together to go over something. And I pulled up my calendar and I was looking through it, and it was like, COVID data stand up, methane data analysis meeting, meeting with the Air Force, meeting with, this big energy company around greenhouse gases, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the whole calendar was just like filled with these really heavy problems. And, there's this advice that like you should work on really big things, on things that really matter. And I think because I'm drawn towards like, let's work on the things that we're passionate about, indirectly, our team ended up working on things that really matter. And that means every day we wake up and we're like, the things that we are doing impact people's lives. And therefore, I'm going to push really hard all day. So my parting advice is to work on really big problems, really big, really complex, possibly even seemingly unsolvable problems, because those are the ones that really end up making your days feel worthwhile, and end up feeling fulfilling, even when you're like totally in the grind and working insane hours. That's my parting advice, is make sure you're working on problems that you care about.
I think that's amazing advice. And there's no shortage of huge problems. So I feel like
Yeah.
that is such good advice.
Yeah, every time I see something really insane in the world, I always take a step back and I'm like, well, I will never be bored. Like, there are so many things that need to be fixed. So we will always have problems to solve.
I'm so grateful, Rachel, that, we met through my wife, Dulcie, at Stanford, and we were able to have this time together where you shared your journey. If people want to be able to follow along as you grow and as Geosite grows, or maybe even have the chance to kind of connect with you, how could they do that?
Yeah, the best way, although I'm pretty terrible about social media, is my Twitter. So I do have a Twitter. It's just @_ Rachel Olney, like my name. And, I should be more disciplined and tweet more of my journey. I have lots of people telling me I should. I've never even really had much of a Facebook. It's just not my thing. But that's the best place, and I do try to put my best nuggets of wisdom there.
Okay, perfect. I will leave a link to your Twitter in the description so everyone can go follow you. I really appreciate the time, Rachel. Thanks so much. It's been really helpful.
Thank you, Rob.